Gabor, it's so good to be with you today.
Soren, I couldn't be more grateful. What we're going to talk about is a subject that's so deeply ensconced in my heart that I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to speak about it.
Yeah, wonderful. So it's October 26th. People will be viewing this at different times on YouTube or whatever video channel they're watching it on. The world is going through immense suffering and pain right now, and particularly the people in the Israel-Palestine conflict. And so I want to talk to you about that today. I want to talk to you about your lessons and learning about what actually heals trauma and how do we address the current situation, but maybe more importantly, how do we plant seeds so that pain and suffering and violence doesn't just get passed on from one generation to another generation, and that future children don't have to be suffering in the way that so many children are suffering now. I know you probably don't have every answer to every question, but I feel like it's so important that we talk about it and that we name it and that we see that there's this pain that has the potential to be healed. And so I want to first start with your own journey and understanding your past with this topic. But before we go there, the events of October 7th were just enormously painful for so many people. And I would love to just hear kind of how that hit you, where you were, how that impacted you. And I know that so many people in Israel and the Jewish population just felt like the tragedy of that was just ignited a deep, deep hurt and pain and suffering. And so I'm curious, like, how was that when you first heard of that news, and how did that land with you?
October the 7th found me in Belgrade, Serbia, the former Yugoslavia. I was undertaking a 10-day speaking tour through the former Yugoslavia. From Belgrade, my next stop was going to be Sarajevo.
Wow.
And as you know, there was terrible history between the Serbs and the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina in the 1990s with awful events that befell people, with horrible suffering inflicted mostly on the Muslim population, but there were mutual atrocities.
Yeah.
And this was part of an effort on the part of the Djokovic Foundation, the tennis player Novak Djokovic and his wife Jelena, to bring some healing, new attitudes towards child development, preventing future trauma. It was in that setting that this terrible news of what happened on October 7th struck me. And my first reaction was really, it was beyond speech.
Yeah.
It was just deep sorrow, grief for all the suffering that was being inflicted on that day on the civilians in Israel, which nothing that I will say in the ensuing conversation can possibly justify. So there's no justification here for that kind of suffering, for that kind of atrocity.
Yeah.
At the same time, knowing something of the history, I knew what was going to come down.
Yeah.
I knew the terrible suffering that Israel was going to impose on the Palestinians, including the civilian population. There's been too many instances of that, and I was just terribly worried about everything was going to happen, and of course has happened since. So I had this double reaction of being appalled at the atrocities of that day and terribly worried about the further atrocities that will follow. That was my reaction. And I was interviewed in Canadian television and radio. I spoke briefly, one of these 5-minute interviews where you have to compress 80 years of history into...
I know I reached out to you around that time. I said, can we do a Zoom on this? You said, let me wait till we get home till I can kind of like actually give it the time and attention that it needs. So that's partly how we showed up here today, with your desire to really speak to it in a thoughtful, clear way when you have some time.
I mean, my initial reaction was, yes, let's do it.
Yeah.
And I was going to do it at 10 o'clock in the evening from Sarajevo. That would have been a big mistake.
Yeah.
But when I did speak on Canadian media, I immediately quoted both Israeli and Palestinian friends of mine who had reached out to me for support. An Israeli woman who was a psychologist, who was very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but who was just appalled and in fear because she had to evacuate her home with her daughter.
Wow.
And she was working with traumatized people. I heard from a Palestinian friend who lives in Ramallah, whose neck had been broken by the Israeli army at a peaceful demonstration.
Wow.
she's been through a lot. Now she's pregnant, and she was terribly worried about the impact of all this on her yet unborn child.
Yeah.
And it was ironic because I knew about the study that was done in 1967 on Israeli women. In the lead up to the 67 war, there was a lot of anxiety, stress, and angst in that country. Women pregnant then, their children were more likely to develop schizophrenia as adults. So I knew that what was going on right now is going to have ramifications, reverberations for generations. Just more trauma, more suffering for everyone. It felt awful.
Yeah, I hear you. And some people watching this will probably know some of your past, but for those who don't, maybe we can talk a little bit about your history and your own direct experience with some of the atrocities that have happened to the Jewish people. I know your grandparents died at Auschwitz, I believe, killed at Auschwitz. You grew up seeking identity as a young man. So could you talk a little bit about your own personal history with war and with atrocities and how that's impacted your life today?
Yeah, sure. What I'm thinking about is that sometimes people have this point of view that you choose the moment of your birth, and your parents. And I think, what kind of an idiot would choose to be born a Jewish infant in Hungary in January 1944? Towards the end of the Second World War, Hungary was an ally of Germany. As such, it was not occupied by the Germans. So although there was a lot of anti-Semitism, the genocide had not yet struck Hungary. But 2 months after I was born, in January 44, in March, Hungary tried to wiggle its way out of the German alliance, seeing which way the cards were stacked by that point. Germany occupied Hungary, and then the genocide of the Hungarian Jewry began, which, according to Eichmann, its chief organizers, it went like a dream. They managed to kill more people in the shortest space of time they had done anywhere else in Eastern Europe. And between March and June of 1944, they murdered 500,000 people, including my grandparents. And it would have included my mother and I had we not stayed in Budapest. Had my mother moved to her parents in southern Slovakia, we would have been in that number. And this is a story I've told before, but people think people don't remember their infancy. They don't recall it, but they remember it.
The cells remember it.
The body remembers, the brain, the nervous system remembers. The day after the Germans marched into Budapest, there was this phone call by my mother to the pediatrician to say, "Would you please come and see my son, because he's crying all the time." And my mother said, and then the pediatrician said, "Yes, of course I'll come, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying." And that sorrow that I ingested from my mother has been in me all my life. And I'm thinking of all the crying babies now in Israel, and especially right now in Gaza with the bombing. I just feel for it all. So I survived the year with my mother, barely. I was very ill at 11 months of age. My grandparents had been killed in Auschwitz in June. The same day they were deported. Although my mother didn't know that, they were deported that day. Her breast milk dried up. So empathetically, she knew. My aunt was taken to Auschwitz. She was a medical doctor. She came back at the end of the war weighing 80 pounds, wearing a discarded German army uniform. That's the only thing she could find. My father was in forced labor. For the most part of that year, my mother did not know if he was dead or alive.
So the Nazis had him, and they had
It was the Hungarian army that had constricted him to this Jewish forced labor battalion. And when I was 11 months of age, to save my life, my mother gave me to a Christian woman in the streets of Budapest, and I didn't see her for 5 or 6 weeks. But let me tell you a story that I didn't know until maybe 2 or 3 years ago. There was a cousin of mine whose family looked after me during those weeks where I was separated from my mother, because they were living under marginally better circumstances. And I was very ill. I had dysentery, I had bronchitis. I was 11 months of age. My uncle took it upon himself to stray outside the area where Jews are allowed to live to find a Christian doctor to come and see me. Really, he took his life into his hands. And he knocked on the door where it's a pediatrician. This young woman comes out and says, I'm the pediatrician. Promised to come to see me the next day. So this Christian doctor comes to see me at this hidden Jewish refuge. Everybody in the apartment, there was 24 people living in 3 rooms, and everybody in the apartment was scared as to what this Christian woman would do. Well, all she did is she examined me. She decided I didn't have tuberculosis, which is what they were afraid of. Gave me medicine. My cousin, who was 13 years old then, wrote in her diary, which I read for the first time 2 years ago.
Wow.
As she was leaving, I was crying on the table, and the doctor pats my head. She said, "Don't worry, my little son, you'll pay them back later."
Wow.
Meaning, not that you'll take revenge, but that the goodness that you're receiving, you'll pay them back. And whether I'm right or not wrong on this issue, or any other issue, this urge to give back to the world the goodness that I received.
That's beautiful.
And of course, as an infant, I could only interpret my mother's giving it to strangers and abandonment. It was many years later that I understood how the universe had conspired to save my life. And what I experienced was abandonment, was a tremendous act of love.
Wow.
So when I'm in a relatively grounded space, which is far from always, these days I feel tremendous gratitude. And on this issue, and I'm so grateful for this conversation, I just want to help people make sense out of it. So that going forward, we don't keep repeating and perpetrating on each other what I began to experience almost from the moment I was born.
Yeah, of course. And I totally understand that sense of responsibility to act and to say something. Even if I have a lot of friends who are like, don't talk about this because you're just going to upset a lot of different people. And it feels to me that there's an obligation that we have to talk about it in ways that hopefully can expand even slightly a little bit more compassion. Because if we don't, future generations are going to suffer the same seeds that are sown in this generation. And we owe it to the people currently, and we owe it to future generations to at least try to find our way. And I think so many people look to you as, you're have best-selling books on trauma, you've worked with all kinds of populations, as a particular voice that's important that maybe can gently guide us through what is so delicate and so tender and yet so important. And
let me tell you about this bracelet of mine, okay?
Please.
I've never worn a bracelet in my whole life. I've had this for 5 weeks, 6 weeks. I was up in Haida, which is a group of islands in northern British Columbia, where the indigenous population had been there for 13,000 years. Under colonialism, they underwent tremendous suffering due to the smallpox that wiped out 80% of the population almost within weeks.
Wow.
And also because of the colonial oppression. And I was up there giving a trauma workshop to Haida people.
Wow.
And a woman in her 70s, at the end of the workshop, or at least close to the end, came up, choked voice. She said, "I've forgotten my language." She said, "Until I was 5, I could speak perfect Haida. Now," she says, "even when I try to study it, the words don't stick in my mind." I said, "What happened to you?" Well, to make it very short, when she went to the school and she dared to speak her tribal language, the teacher took a heavy stick and beat her about the face and the body and the head relentlessly. I helped her to understand that what she was ashamed of, including her passivity in the face of this aggression, was what saved her life.
Wow.
and that her forgetting her language was her organism's way of protecting her. Because had she spoken it again, she would have suffered even more grievous suffering.
Wow.
So she relaxed quite a bit. She even laughed, and she was going to go back and learn her language again. But at the end of it, the Haida people gave me this bracelet. It's a carving. And the meaning is, these words matter. So how we speak about anything in this world, especially anything so painful and so mutually traumatic and so encrusted with history, not just history, but certain interpretations of history, and so much pain. These words matter. And so I pray that in this conversation, you and I will be able to speak in a way where, at the very least, we don't add to the burden of pain. Although inevitably, as you alluded, this is not a subject that's easy to talk about. And I've often said that on this subject, you could speak with the humility of Moshe Rabbeinu or teacher or Moses, with the deep compassion of Buddha and the loving heart of Jesus. And some people will still dislike it and resent it. And I can't help that.
Yeah, and we do our best.
4 years ago, they found some, seems like, buried bodies of indigenous kids here in British Columbia. And we know that thousands died in the residential schools run by various churches and the governments here in Canada. Thousands died of children. 3 weeks before these bodies were found, there was a poll done here in Canada, an opinion poll. 70% of Canadians said they knew nothing or little about the residential schools. It's possible to live in this country, to grow up in this country, to go to school in this country, and not know what happened to the indigenous people.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid the same thing is true all over the world.
Yeah.
And wherever there's conflict, especially when there's an indigenous population that is displaced, people don't know.
Yeah.
I have friends of mine who come from South Africa who growing up didn't know what was happening a few miles away from their homes. So this is not to blame anybody, but just to say that, I began to reread Herodotus' histories last night again. And Herodotus was the first historian. You know what history means?
Past events.
Yeah.
Relevant past events.
No, that's what I thought too. The actual Greek meaning of the word is investigation, inquiry. So I hope that we can approach the subject, not with the sense of, here's what the past events, know what happened. Yeah. But actually with a sense of curiosity and inquiry and research. That's what the word actually means. Yeah. And so many people on the subject, they think they know what happened. Yeah. But if you ask them, have you researched it? Do you know the other point of view? Yeah. If you're going to refute the other point of view, can you state it succinctly and accurately enough so that you know what you're refuting? Right. My experience on this issue, that's very rare. Yeah. Most of us have, we have friends who represent both sides. I have friends who are Israeli who tell me this is one of the worst events that have happened to us since the Holocaust. We have to respond, we have to protect ourselves, and it has to be strong and forceful. And I understand what that feeling must be like. Yeah. And then I have Palestinian friends who are like, we have been pretty much in an open air prison in Gaza for years and years. Our property was taken from us. This is just yet another opportunity for someone else to kill innocent people in our world. And I understand the intensity of both of those feelings. And then I have a lot of other friends who don't necessarily have a personal experience. And they're just like, I just hate seeing babies killed and young people killed and bombing innocent people. And so I'm wondering, with the pain that we're all experiencing, one way is to definitely research and find what is actually true. And if I'm seeing it from this perspective, what was it like if I saw it from this other perspective? I think that's really, really healthy. Do you have a sense for the people out there that are feeling like immobilized and feeling just
heavied and weighted down by just the pain of this, and they don't know what to do or how to process it. Do you have a sense of how we might as a world kind of navigate the situation in a way that's as thoughtful and wise as possible?
In my own marriage, there have been plenty of examples, and I've talked about them publicly, where my current reaction to some event, some exchange between my wife Ray and I, triggers old pains. Mm-hmm. And I'm not only experiencing what's going on right now, I'm also re-experiencing something that happened long ago.
Yeah.
That's the nature of traumatic memory. Mm-hmm. Now that can happen on the individual level. It's even more likely to happen on a collective level. Mm-hmm. As a Jewish kid growing up in Hungary, not just in the aftermath of this worst crime in history, and it's difficult to choose what's the worst crime in history, but I'd have to say that the mechanized, deliberate, planned, scientifically conducted, as it were, killing of a whole people. I can't think of anything worse. And it's so recent. Yeah. So I grew up not only in the shadow of that, but also with the actual reality of anti-Semitism in Hungary. Mm-hmm. I mean, my brother and I were at times bullied for being Jewish. I had to change classes at some point in the school I was going to. And I've talked about this once we were being bullied for being Jewish, and this friend of mine came to my defense. And here's the defense. Leave him alone. It's not his fault he's Jewish. Mm. It's a fault, but, he couldn't help it. He wasn't, That's where I grew up. Now, when I say this, when I've said this before, people think I'm ashamed of being Jewish. Well, the heck I am. Mm-hmm. I am Jewish. That's what I am. Right. It's a lot of tradition there to relate to and to be proud about, actually. But I used to be ashamed of being Jewish. Mm. I used to try and hide it. I used to be ashamed of my Jewish looks. Mm. The American black psychologist, Ken Hardy, talks about the assaulted sense of self. Where you take on the view of the oppressor and the abuser, and you make it your view of yourself. And I was reminded of Malcolm X talking about how he tried to conk his hair, make it straight, so he would look less like a black man. And when he became a militant, he said to an audience, "Who taught you to hate the size of your lips and the shape of your nose, and the configuration of your body and the color of your skin?" Well, I used to be in that mindset. Yeah. And when I came to Canada, when it came to staying home from Jewish holidays, I wouldn't tell the teacher why I stayed home. And then Zionism came along. And I discovered this pride in being Jewish. Now we're no longer helpless and passive and victims, but the barbed wire of Auschwitz is now being replaced by the boundaries of a free state, and the fallen heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto are now vindicated and manifested in the proud army of Israel. And for me, that was so liberating. So I totally identify with that history and that way of understanding the future. Yeah. I totally understand why any fellow Jew would feel the same way. Yeah. In that light, what happened recently is just another example of Jews being killed for being Jews. I get it. Yeah. And I go back to what I said about history. It's an investigation. It's an inquiry. It's not just a set of facts that we accept as given. When I inquired in my late teens, all of a sudden, what I thought were facts and what I thought was an ironclad interpretation of the past turned out to be much more elusive and much more complicated and much less flattering to my own identification.
There was a notion, a land without a people for people without a land, that was not necessarily, had more nuance than...
Well, if you look at Zionist history, back in 1890s, when there's only a few thousand Jews in Israel, in what is now Israel, still under Ottoman occupation, there was a Jewish spiritual leader and teacher called Asher Ginsburg, whose Hebrew name was Ahad Aham, one people. That's the name of it. That's what his name meant.
That's great.
And he said that if what we're doing now to the Arabs, he said then, is the Messiah coming? I don't want to see him arrive. Because all that's going to happen is there'll be one small Levantine people tormenting another Levantine people.
Right.
In 1905, at a Zionist Congress, there were people who said, our slogan is, a land without a people for a people without a land. But there is no land without a people.
Mm-hmm.
There were people living there. They've been living there for a long time. And it was really clear to anybody who was clear-minded, whatever the historical right that Jews had to Palestine, going back to biblical times, if you want to argue that biblical case, or whether you simply wanted to agree that because of the egregious suffering of Jews in Eastern Europe before the Holocaust, or in fact throughout Europe, historically speaking, going back to massacres in England and France and in the Middle Ages, whether that suffering entitled the Jews to a land of their own in a homeland to which they had historical and spiritual ties. Grant all that. You still had to go through the inconvenient fact that there was a local population who had no reason to want to give up their homes. And in 1920, Dr. Ader, he was the head of the Zionist Commission, he said that our aim, in the shortest time possible, is to make Palestine as Jewish, as America as American, and in England as British. Well, grant his right to say that. I would argue history differently, but let's grant his right to say that and his desire to make it true. How are the local population supposed to feel about it? And we know how they're supposed to feel about it because top Zionist leaders said so. So Vladimir Jabotinsky was the head of the founder of the revisionist Zionist wing of the Zionist movement, a right wing. His party became the Likud, the Herut, and then the Likud, the current government. Jabotinsky. David Ben-Gurion, his rival, was the head of the labor Zionist movement, and he became the first prime minister of Israel. Both Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion, in the same terms, almost the same terms, said in the 1930s, privately, that we call the Arab terrorists, but these are just people defending their homeland. We would do the same thing if we were in their position. So on the one hand, the interpretation was for public purposes that we're fighting terrorists. Internally, they knew that what they were doing was trying to displace the people that were doggedly trying to defend their homeland. This is before 1947, 48. This is going back to the 30s. Then there's the whole history. I don't know whether or not you want to go into it now of what happened in 1947, 48. But let me quote something to you from an Israeli journalist. And people, when they talk with me, they often tell me, you don't live there, you're not Israeli, you don't know what's going on. All right, it's true. I'm not an Israeli. I don't live there. I'm also not an American. But I do have opinions about American foreign policy or about American civil rights. I'm also not a Saudi, but I have an opinion about what they do to women there. I'm also not a Russian, but I have an opinion on the Ukraine war.
You're a human being.
I'm also not a Ukrainian. I also have an opinion on that. So don't tell me I'm not an Israeli. I don't live there, okay? Unless nobody who doesn't live somewhere has any right to say anything about anywhere else. Let's just give that one up, okay? But granted, I'm not an Israeli. Let me quote you an Israeli.
Please.
This is Amira Haas, who's an Israeli journalist. She's lived in the West Bank for 30 years. She was on the program Democracy Now! Recently. That's a segment everybody should watch.
Okay.
She happened to be in New York on October the 7th. For 10 minutes, this principled, brave woman who's written in the Israeli press regularly about the experience of Palestinians was speechless with grief. And she wrote recently, in a few days, Israelis went through what Palestinians have experienced as a matter of routine for decades and are still experiencing, including military incursions, death, cruelty, slain children, bodies piled up in the road, siege, fear, anxiety over loved ones, captivity, and searing humiliation. I didn't say that. An Israeli journalist said it. And there are Israelis who see that. But it's so difficult anywhere in the world, including here in Canada, in Australia, in the States, for anybody to put themselves in the position and the experience of the other. We tend to experience the world. The Buddha said 2,500 years ago, 2,600 years ago now, that basically with our minds we create the world. That's the first statement in
the Dhammapada.
In the Dhammapada, with our thoughts or in the lead. What he didn't say, and that's modern psychology, is that before with our minds we create the world creates our minds. And much of the mind of collective humanity is created by trauma. And so that lens of trauma then is what interprets present circumstances for us. And that's what's going on so much right now. And Robert Sapolsky, who is a wonderful neurobiologist and neuroscientist and writer at Stanford, he just came up with a book called Determined. And in this book he argues that basically there's no free will. That is it okay if I quote him?
You can do anything you want.
We are nothing more or less than the sum of that which we could not control, our biology, environments, their interactions. He goes almost so far as to say that there's no such thing as free will. In other words, so many of our reactions are a product of our past. What family we were born into, what our sensitivity is biologically, what stories we were told as children, what our environment is telling us, what our identification is with this group or that group. And then we think we're free and we know the facts. But the facts, as the Buddha points out, are a product of a particular interpretation of the world. And the question is, can we become free of all that? Now, I'd love to talk to Robert and say, are you saying that no free will is possible at all? I mean, can we not get to a state of consciousness where we can actually be aware, and including of our own reactions and our own emotions? So there's nothing on the emotional level that I don't understand about the reactions on both sides. And the grief and the pain on the Jewish Israeli side, how could it be otherwise? Given just what just happened. But is it true that this is just another incident in a long history of unmerited Jewish suffering? Or is it possible that maybe we've done something to contribute? Not to justify what happened, because nothing justifies what happened. Nothing justifies the killing of innocents. But is it something that we may have done, as Amir Huss points out?
And I think, do we have a responsibility to not only this generation, but to future generations to look at the causes and conditions that lead to something? And most Israelis I talk to, most Jewish people I talk to, most Palestinians I talk to, it's not working for them. They don't feel safe. They would love to not spend billions of dollars on bombs and missiles and spend those billions of dollars building schools and childcare centers and hospitals and malls and like places for people to thrive. And I get the sense that like most people actually would love to live in a place where they could do that, right? Where the bombing would stop on both sides. And I don't know if it's a lack of leadership or if it's the pain of all these years just builds up. And so there's no way to turn that. It feels sometimes like there's no way to turn that around. And every Israeli that's killed, that family wants revenge. And every Palestinian that's killed, understandably, they too want revenge, right? And so there's a world where it's getting more and more like hot and fire. And what I worry about this situation is that it spreads and there's more hate crimes and there's more of this element of wanting revenge. And I get it. Like, I understand that feeling. And I'm also wondering, where does that end? And is there a way in which maybe these narratives that we've kept going for all these years, are they helpful, these identities and these narratives? Or in some ways, do we need to actually kind of expand our sense of who we think we are? That we're human beings. You know, I was reading recently that we're all part of they call her the mitochondrial Eve. She lived 155,000 years ago, and she's our DNA to every human being existing. Our mother.
Yeah.
And so on one level, we're all the same family. I mean, you can say you're Jewish, I'm not, whatever, but like on another level, if you look at the lens, you could say we're all Milky Way Galaxian, or you could say we're all human. We're all basically the same. And is that part of the answer? Or how do you look at and see like the role of identity and narrative when it's helpful, and also maybe when it's not helpful, and when those particular mindsets aren't helping us create peace and create a more loving world?
Well, so many things come up for me as you pose that question, which is not only a question, it's also an eloquent statement of how it might be. You know, when is the issue of identity? What does it mean? It comes from Latin. Idem means the same, as in identical, and facere is to make. When we identify with something, we make ourselves the same as something.
Yeah.
If I identify with a certain group, and my identify is restricted to that, making the same as that group, then I'm going to experience everything largely through the majority experience or perspective of that group.
Yeah.
Look, I've just been through the former Yugoslavia, where, as I mentioned, the events and the perpetrations were horrible. But I was hosted by the Novak Djokovic Foundation. Djokovic himself is actually part Croat and part Serb. And although he identifies mostly as a Serb, but their foundation and his wife Jelena, they're just committed to peaceful child development, to make sure that parents treat their kids in such a way that they won't grow up full of hatred.
Wow.
And then we were in Sarajevo, where I had Muslim people come up to me, recognizing me, just thanking me for my work. And the same thing in Catholic Ljubljana in Slovenia. I'm telling you, Soren, you're so right. People just want to experience peace.
Yeah.
They just want to bring up their kids in a safe environment. They don't want to feel threatened. And this is true whether you're Jewish or Christian or Muslim, Buddhist, whoever you are, whether you're Israeli or Palestinian.
Yeah.
This is true for most people.
Yeah.
What complicates things are a number of factors. One of them is identification. And generally, once you identify with a group, a sense of victimization comes very easy.
Yeah.
Now, just in Hungary, where there's a monument near the parliament buildings, beautiful old parliament buildings. Hungary is a victim of Germany.
Wow.
The German eagles.
That's what the monument says? Or
the German eagles swooping down on poor defenseless Hungary.
Wow.
That's not the history. The history was that Hungary, due to its leadership, was an ally of Germany.
Yeah.
Hungary had the first anti-Semitic laws in Europe way back in the 1920s, well before the Germans did.
Yeah.
The Hungarian state cooperated with the deportation of the Jews enthusiastically in 1944. Eichmann only had a couple of dozen SS men with him in Budapest. They couldn't have deported 500,000 Jews.
Yeah.
It took the Hungarian gendarmerie and the state apparatus to transport those Jews to Auschwitz. Yeah. And Hungary attacked Russia along with Germany. And 2,000 Hungarian young men died.
Wow.
Trying to subdue the Russians. Then the Russians came back in, and they occupied Hungary. Germany occupied Hungary only when Hungary tried to leave the German alliance. But the Hungarian government currently spreads this idea that we were the victims.
Right.
We had no role in this whatsoever.
Right.
And everywhere in the world it's like that.
Yeah.
When people identify, it's so much easier to see ourselves as victims, and which is not to say that no real victimization took place.
Sure. Right.
Hungary suffered terribly, for example, under the Russian occupation and the brutal communist dictatorship.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
At the same time, let's acknowledge that it wasn't Russia that attacked Hungary first, it was Hungary that attacked Russia first.
Yeah, I do that in my personal life. I'm like, this person's an asshole, and this person did this to me. And then if I actually am honest about myself, I generally had created conditions that supported that action. Like they're responsible for that action. Exactly. But I did things like passive aggressive statements, and then I like get mad at my partner for getting mad at me. But in general, if I'm really honest with myself, I'm feeding that fire in some ways. And I think that's really what you're talking about, right?
And that's the same in my marriage.
Yeah.
And so when you're asking what's the way out, self-examination is the first step, And the Krishnamurti, who is the spiritual teacher, he said that action is meaning only in relationship, he said. Action is meaning only in relationship.
Okay.
He said, without understanding relationship, action on any level will only breed conflict. The understanding of relationship is infinitely more important than the search for any plan of action, said Krishnamurti. And I've used that as the epigraph to two of my books. It's so true.
Yeah.
So if we want to understand something, let's begin. Let's at least begin with the willingness to look at our role and our own contribution to that relationship in which we're suffering.
Right.
Again, that doesn't justify
any action,
any particular action, but at least it provides a context. And it's not about making the wrong pass. Sapolsky, who I quoted, says something interesting. He said two things. He talks about the absurdity of hating any person for anything they have done. Given that in his view, we're so determined that everything we do is determined by the past, so then
it's like the sun, getting mad at the sun for rising and shining. Yeah.
And he also says, there's no such thing as free will, and blame and punishment are without ethical justification. Now, I don't agree with him. I think it's possible to get to a position of free will, but I don't think most of us have it most of the time.
Yeah.
So in the interaction that you witnessed this morning between my wife and I, there were two people both lacking free will, acting on programming. To get to free will, it takes extraordinary effort to become conscious. So, conscious means you're aware of what's inside you. So there might be rage inside you, perfectly justified.
Yeah.
There might be hatred inside you, perfectly justified. There might be a desire for revenge inside you, perfectly justified. When I say justified, understandable.
Absolutely.
But they're not guides for action.
Yes.
The only guide for action is where we're in a non-defensive state. When I say non-defensive, we might take a defensive stance, but an emotionally non-defensive state where our prefrontal cortex, the midfrontal cortex, whose job it is to have insight, empathy, self-regulation, compassion. When that's online, we might talk about free will. When we're regulated by our emotional reactions, collective or emotional, there's no free will.
I think this piece about honoring and feeling the emotions that people are feeling, because I think a lot of people feel hopelessness right now, they feel rage right now, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the importance to honor those feelings, but actually to not actually be directed by them, that there's a different place from which we can act, and at the same time, so could you talk about how you see people do that?
Sure. Well, recently, because of stresses that I was experiencing in my own life, I decided to do something desperate, which is to meditate. I mean, how desperate can you get?
So was this the 2 weeks you took off?
Yeah.
I remember
took
you
2
telling me
weeks
that.
of a break from emails, internet, everything,
Yeah.
and I began to immerse myself in, spiritual literature again and meditation and so on. And the Buddha never told his followers not to feel hate, or not to feel angry, or not to feel grief, not to feel sadness or fear. He said, you will notice when there's fear in you. You will notice when there's hatred in you. You will notice when there's grief. You'll be aware of it so that it doesn't rule you.
Yeah.
And so those are just human emotions. They're going to happen. Question is, what's going to govern our actions? Now let me quote you an Israeli psychiatrist.
Please.
Who wrote a recent piece in the Wall Street Journal. He said, Israel, a country founded on the trauma of the Holocaust, raised generations of soldiers and fighters who fought to make sure Jews would never be led like lambs to the slaughter again. Turning passive into active and victim into victor is an unconscious way to manage trauma. When you read the histories of the 1947-48 events in Palestine, and particularly the 48 war, many of the soldiers fighting in the new Israeli army were actually immigrants from Europe, escapees from the horrors of the Nazi genocide. Whenever fighting the Arabs, they literally perceived themselves as fighting just another group of Nazis trying to kill Jews.
Wow.
It's totally understandable why they would have seen it that way. What they didn't understand is that those were just local people trying to hold on to their lands, or other Arabs coming to help them. Maybe we'll talk more about that history a bit later. But this same psychiatrist says recently in the Wall Street Journal, the wish to repair, and this time to emerge from battles victorious, is based on the illusion that when we do so, we become winners, that we can end and master our suffering. If only we win, then we have mastered our suffering. In fact, a soldier's victory is never just a victory, he says, but a double-edged sword that leads to loss and to cycles of trauma and violence that are carried from generation to generation.
Yes.
Because there's such a thing as karma in this world. And karma doesn't mean retribution in the future. Trauma actually means the action that we're undertaking now and the intention and the mindset with which we undertake those actions. And yes, those will have impacts. It's impossible from a vengeful place to create a peaceful world. The very thing you want is the thing that you're undermining. Now, there's something in Jewish tradition that's very unique. And I'd say it's the best, certainly the aspect of the Jewish tradition that I most identify with and honor. And that's the prophetic tradition. And the prophetic tradition is not predicting the future, but seeing how the present is going to show up in the future. And the essence of it is that the prophet stands up and says to the king, you have no right. There's a higher value than state, than armies and chariots, than your own interests. And that higher value comes from a universal source that we can call God. And some people do. But that you will break those laws at your peril. And you're going to create suffering. I don't know too many other religions where the right to speak the truth to power is not only historically recorded, but actually honored. Now, the prophets didn't usually have a good time in their days.
Right.
It's not that they were welcomed with open arms.
Yeah.
But that's a part of Jewish tradition I'm really proud
Yeah.
of.
Yeah.
Now, there were such people all along as Zionism unfolded its particular trajectory who said, if you're going to keep doing this, this is going to be the result. There were people who said so in 1905, in 1920, in the 30s, right around the time of the funding of the state, who keep pointing out there were people at the time of the 1967 victory where the occupied territories became occupied territories. We're heading down a dangerous path.
Yeah.
We're going to create more and more suffering. Were they ever right?
Yeah.
Another point is, people don't have to take my word for it. They can research it. I've said this before. Albert Speer, who was Hitler's architect and one of the economic constructors of the Nazi regime, he spent 20 years in Spandau prison as a war criminal. He probably got off light at 20 years. Whether genuinely or whether opportunistically, underwent a kind of remorseful reevaluation. But he said something that, whether he meant it genuinely, whether he didn't, was absolutely true. He said, in Germany, it wasn't a matter of what you knew. It's a matter of what you could have known, how you wanted to. Like all the Germans that watched the Jews being taken away, they might have asked questions. He himself describes two incidents. Speer does in his autobiography. One time he was talking to a general, and he says to the general casually, "I'd like to visit the East sometime." And the general said, "You don't want to go there." Speer said, "I never asked why not. I could have asked." Another time, he was at a factory where they were using workers seconded from some of the concentration camps. And he asked them, "Would you rather be here or would you rather be in the camps?" They froze in horror as they looked at him. He said, "I never asked them why. I could have asked." Now, today, people have the capacity to read the Israeli historians, not Arab historians, not anti-Semitic historians, Israeli historians who have access to the records that have been opened about Zionist history, and particularly the events of 1947-48. They could read Benny Morris on the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem, the deliberate expulsion, massacre, dispossession, oppression. It wasn't an accident, it was planned. Ilan Pappé, P-A-P-P-E, an Israeli historian, lives now in London, or I should say in Britain. His book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. You may not believe that that's what happened, but what right have you got to speak on the subject if you haven't even looked at the evidence? And he documents the killings, the expulsions, the destructions of homes, the rape, the brutality that was planned and carried out with deliberate intention. And you could read Avi Schleim, you can read Tom Segev.
Do you think if people educated themselves in that way, so they would see it not only from one point of view, but also really understand the history so we can see it, that there would be a way that these two communities could find a way to live in harmony? Or how would it work that you could have, like within Gaza, like 2-3 million people living right next to Israel? And education definitely seems to be one way, Gabor, but I think a lot of people are also looking at what is the path forward that presents, and education definitely is one piece, but I didn't know if there's other pieces.
You know what the one place on earth is where more Israelis live than in almost any other place?
No.
Berlin.
Huh.
Yeah, there's a lot of Israelis in Berlin.
Huh.
They live a life of freedom, creativity. They can't. Some of them went there to escape the narrowness and chauvinism of their own country.
Wow.
I know friends who live there. If Hitler had a grave, which he doesn't because they burned his body, but he'd be rolling in his grave at the gay Israelis who live in it. Not only are they Israelis, some of them are actually gay. You know, this is the guy who hated gays and Jews. You know, it's possible, right?
It's possible.
And what happened? The Germans actually took responsibility.
Yeah.
They actually said, "Here's our history.
Yeah.
We're not going to deny it. We're going to acknowledge it." I was just in Belgrade, Sarajevo, through terrible suffering, not 90 years ago, 80 years ago, as in the Second World War, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 25 years ago. People are actually living at peace. It's not that all the wounds are healed.
Yeah.
That's going to take generations. But they're living in peace, working together, cooperating, creating together. They have their tensions. But it's possible.
And it's possible in part because the leadership took responsibility. Am I understanding you right?
Well, here's the problem. Here's a huge problem. And I'm going to return to Canada now as an example. In Canada, in the Second World War, the Canadian Japanese were interned as they were in the US as potential enemies, which was nonsense, of course. But not only were they interned, you might make a case that you have to remove these people from the coast in case they have too much loyalty to the land of their forebears. But do you have to rob them of their goods at the same time? Do you have to dispossess them? Couldn't you just, keep them safe and after the war give them their houses back? No, they were dispossessed, robbed, despoiled of their goods and exposed to all kinds of racism. The Canadian government has apologized to the Japanese community for what it did. Didn't give the goods back, but it apologized. I mentioned in Canada the history of residential schools. The Pope, incidentally, recently came to Canada to apologize for the church's role. In his residential schools, kids were beaten for speaking their language, as I mentioned. Little girls, 4 years old, had a pin stuck in their tongue if they spoke their native language. They were sexually, physically, emotionally abused. They died. Their parents were jailed if they tried to see their children. And this went on for over 100 years, until recently. As a result, suicide rate, disease rate, autoimmune disease, addictions, lateral violence, kids sniffing glue, self-cutting, early death, diabetes is so much more prevalent in the native population. It's strictly a trauma outcome. And the Canadian government has apologized for the residential schools. Very nice. It's easy to apologize for something that somebody else did some decades ago. You know what they haven't apologized for yet? We've apologized to the Japanese for taking their goods. We have not apologized to indigenous people for taking their lands and their resources and their forests and their rivers and their oceans. Why haven't we apologized? Because we're still taking it. We're not going to apologize for something we're still doing.
Yeah, we have to give it back.
If Israel could acknowledge, without obliterating its own right to exist, because the past is past. No matter what happened in the United States, slavery and the annihilation of indigenous population and their robbery, just all the colonial horrors that were visited on the indigenous population, they happened, and the States is here.
Most of us in California live off land that was at one point indigenous land.
Absolutely, and the same thing in Australia. And even now in the United States, as you know, some people don't want to talk about slavery. And In Ron DeSantis, Florida, there's even some statement in the history books about how the slaves picked up useful skills.
Yeah.
You remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to write an article about that. I want to write an article in response to Ron DeSantis.
Yeah.
And I want to say, thank the Nazis for the concentration camps. Because look at all the useful skills that Jews developed.
Yeah.
How to survive with very little food.
Yeah.
Brazilian. I mean,
It's not.
it makes the blood boil. You know, but here's what I was going to say.
Please.
Israel could acknowledge, look, we decided to form a state. That was our situation. However you felt about it, we felt that our suffering and the urgency of our need overrode whatever rights you may have had locally. But in the process, and we're not going to go away, we're here. But we did rob you. We did kill you. We did misrepresent your history.
Yeah.
We did present ourselves as your victims. We're the ones who imposed the... You didn't come to Europe to attack us.
Yeah.
We came here. And we're not going to do it anymore.
Yeah.
We're not going to keep taking more land away from you. And I'll talk, if you like, about my visits and what I saw there with my own eyes. But we're not going to do it anymore. We acknowledge that we did it. We're not going to give you back any more than America's going to give back the land to the indigenous people. But we accept that you're here, that you have a right to be here, and you have the right to be free of our control, and you have the right to expect some recompense, and you have the right to be reunited with your families. That if I, Gabor, have the right to travel tomorrow and land at Ben Gurion Airport and demand citizenship under the right of return, going back when? 2,000 years ago? Then you as a Palestinian have the right to something similar.
Yeah.
Not that we can accept all the refugees back, but let's at least talk about it.
Yeah.
And we're not going to, well, let's talk about the occupation in a minute. So in other words, if there was some, number one, recognition of what happened in the past, and number two, a determination not to keep doing it, that's what's needed for peace.
Yeah.
You know, but that's not going to happen.
It may. Well, let's say it's unlikely to happen.
Well, okay.
I'd like to keep the possibility that
It's
anything is
unlikely to
possible.
happen
It's
for two
unlikely to happen.
reasons. One is that the underlying Zionist project has always been all of Palestine. We keep talking about the charter of Hamas. I don't know anybody who supports Hamas. But we keep talking about the Hamas charter about taking all the land over from the Jews. You know, anybody know what the Likud constitution says, Likud being the governing party in Israel? That there's no right to any state that's not Jewish between the sea and the Jordan River. You know, well, let's drop that. You know, let's say that there are those two people that have to live together. Let's begin with some acknowledgement. And you know, to their credit, there are Israelis and Palestinians working on that, but they're in a small minority. The reason it's not going to happen is because the overall Zionist project has always been all of Palestine. And it doesn't matter whether it was Labour or Likud or Herut or whoever it was. The only difference was the Labour Party spoke peace and practiced occupation. The Likud doesn't even pretend to talk peace. You know, that's the only difference. But that's in the third reason, I have to say. The third reason is in international politics. Nothing exists in isolation from the rest of the world. And as always, the interests of the great empires dominate the small nations. Now,
and that's the U.S.
Well, in this case, it's the U.S. There could have been no Jewish immigration and the creation of a Jewish army and Jewish institutions in the 1910s, and particularly the 1920s and the 30s, without the protection of the British Empire. The fact that the British Empire eventually became tired of the Zionist project, it still remains a fact that without its protection, there could have been no Zionist project there. And Winston Churchill God loved his imperialist soul, said that the creation of a Jewish entity is in the best interest of the British Empire. When the British Empire faded, replaced by the American Empire, Israel has now become the special project of the American Empire. And if anybody doesn't think that there's an American Empire, just look at who's got 800 military bases around the world.
Yeah.
You know, and, well, this might be an aside, but, you know, January 6th, you know what that commemorates?
In the U.S.?
Yeah.
The attack on the Congress.
Yeah, the Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
Also my birthday. So finally, finally the Americans have recognized the importance of January the 6th, you know. But there's a joke that's all too true. You know why the coup of January 6th didn't work?
No.
Because they didn't have a U.S. embassy supporting it. Because the Americans talk about a 9/11. There was another 9/11. You know where that happened? That happened in Chile, where the American backed and supported Chilean military, overthrew the democratically elected government and killed thousands of people. So the Americans have an empire.
We have a very sordid past, and as an American. And I want to hear about your trip to Gaza, because I don't know actually many people who have actually directly visited Gaza. If there's any positive in this, and I know there's like 10,000 negatives, and this in no way minimizes the immense suffering that Palestinians and Israelis are going through now. But it seems like it has the world's attention in this moment. As an American, I've lived largely in denial. So
what's changed for you?
What's changed for me is all of a sudden I'm realizing there's a conflict in the world that I've ignored, and that I'm as a responsible global citizen, and I can't look at these images of these kids on the TV screen and feel like I don't give a shit about you, and I'm not going to do anything for your behalf. Like I know there's kids in Africa and South America and a lot of places, but like when I see the kids, whether they're Israeli kids or Palestinian kids, I feel like I could be you, you could be me, those could be my kids. Like I feel like we're human beings in a shared predicament. And so part of what inspired me to have this conversation with you, I was like, what can I do that would have one iota of a chance of maybe decreasing the suffering? But to be honest with you, I have not really tended to this. And so I can look at other people and ask them to take responsibility. I also need to acknowledge and apologize in my own way and you can say, well, it's not my job, whatever, but I actually feel as a global citizen that my duty is to do all I can as best I can. And so for me, all this incursion stuff has gotten my attention. I know a lot of other people's attention, and there might be some way in which I'd like to keep the possibility anyways, that there's some way in which the current narratives that are going on in Palestine, from what I'm told, is that the Israeli people are savages. They're just going to bomb us to kill our families. They don't give a shit about us. They put us in these open air prisons, right? And then the narrative that's going on right now, of course, in Israel, I understand, and these people are savages who kill.
Animals.
And who's to argue with any of those narratives? And yet another generation both being raised with those narratives. It's not a surprise that there's going to be more bloodshed and more violence and more kidnapping and more attacks. And so I feel as a human being, what is it that I can do to be supportive in a way? And the kids, I don't know why, these kids that I saw on the TV screen, I go to bed and I just see them, and they have like no voice. Almost no voice. And I don't...
Because of what I said about the perspective and interest of the American Empire, that other perspective, that other experience is just erased. Nobody hears about it. And there is something uniquely horrible right now. I mean, it's impossible to choose horrors, but ranking them in this world, you know. But to me, there's something, and this is subjective. I can't make a rational case for it. But to me, this is awful, and maybe more awful than anything I've ever seen. I lived through the Vietnam War. I was a student then. 3 million Vietnamese civilians were killed based on a complete lie, as we now know. 500,000 Iraqi children before the war died due to sanctions. No medicine, no food.
Yeah.
In Guatemala, 100,000, nobody knows this. Do you know that in Guatemala, 100,000 people were killed in the 1990s?
I didn't know it was that many. But yeah.
100,000, mostly indigenous, by the American and Israeli trained Guatemalan army.
Mm.
Then there's, of course, the beyond speakable horrors of the Nazi genocide.
Yeah.
Several 100,000 people have died in Yemen in the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody talks about it.
I think nobody talks about it because it feels so much to hold. You know, like in the past, humans didn't have YouTube, and like we weren't able to take all in this information.
I beg to differ.
Please.
It's what the media chooses to pay attention to and what it doesn't. And they could pay attention,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't. They decide what's important and what isn't. Now,
On YouTube, though, you can pretty much get anything you want.
yeah, that's true, which goes back to what I said earlier, that these days, there's no excuse for not finding out other points of view. But what is uniquely horrible about what's going on right now is that there was the terrible, unjustifiable atrocity of October the 7th.
Yeah.
None of which can be justified by anything of what I said about the history that preceded it, but which itself doesn't justify anything that followed it. And we're watching these children dying on TV every day, their homes being demolished.
They can't leave.
And we're accepting this as this is normal. That's what's so uniquely horrible, is we're witnessing it. And people find ways of justifying it. People find ways of rationalizing it.
Mm-hmm.
We're so unconscious, and our hearts can be so closed. Couldn't we at least genuinely grieve?
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't we at least say, let's understand what's going on here so that we don't keep perpetrating the same suffering on one another? No. Our politicians blithely mouth phrases about Israel's right to defend itself. No country, everybody's right to defend themselves. Israel has the right to defend itself. Does it have the right to oppress a people to the point of beyond desperation? This Gaza thing that happened was like a boil that's going to erupt at some point.
Yeah.
That doesn't justify what happened.
Sure. But if we care about creating conditions that decrease that happening for future generations, we have to look at it.
So with that, I can go back to my visits there.
Please, please.
Yeah.
And what motivated you to go there?
As I mentioned, I went through my Zionist phase,
Yeah.
which was an important time for me in terms of self-acceptance and pride and a rebirth of my faith in possibility.
Mm-hmm.
And then at some point, it's interesting how it happened. In a Zionist movement, of which I was the local leader of a Zionist youth group, at age 19, but I was given the job of giving a talk on how to counter Arab propaganda on the campuses. We're talking the early 1960s now. So I made the reasonable assumption, if I was going to counter Arab propaganda, maybe I should find out what are they saying, you know? So I began to read histories, not by Arabs, but by Jews. And I realized the narrative that I bought into was not reality. Mm-hmm. There's a whole other side. There's a whole other people with a completely different experience. That if we're going to have any kind of peace, we need to at least understand their view, their narrative, their felt experience. And so by the time the Intifada, the uprising broke out, which is a largely peaceful event, children demonstrating, they threw rocks at tanks, you know, against the occupation. And the Israeli army's response under the later Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was, we're going to defeat this with might and beatings. And they took Palestinian kids and deliberately broke their arms and their legs. Mm-hmm. This is how they fought what was largely a peaceful uprising and protest, largely. There was a Jewish woman in California who led a medical group to support people in the occupied territories, children particularly.
Mm.
And they asked me to come as a medical doctor, to come and visit with them so that we can look at health conditions in Palestine under the occupation.
What year was this?
It would have been the early 90s, during the first Intifada. So I went to the refugee camps in the occupied territories. I went to Gaza. I cried every day for 2 weeks. I cried every day for 2 weeks.
Wow.
And I thought, and I used to believe that this was right.
Yeah.
The daily humiliations, the arrogance of the army, the incredibly self-inflated power and I use the word arrogance again, of the settlers. The sheer evil injustice of it. According to Israeli documents, the average settler got 6 times as much water as the average Palestinian. So I could arrive from Vancouver, become a settler tomorrow. I'd have the right to live in a settlement with a swimming pool. The Palestinians don't have the right to dig wells on their own land. Because to dig wells, they have to have permit. But they don't get permit. So if they dig a well, the army comes and fills them full of stones.
Right.
The burning down, they talked about Palestinian tree terrorism. When I used to go to synagogue here, I can barely set foot in a synagogue anymore for what I want to hear there. No, there are exceptions. They're really good religious Jews and rabbis, really open-minded, sweet, humane people. I'm talking about the unconsciousness and ignorance of the majority. They talked about Palestinian tree terrorism. You know why? Because in the occupied territories, there's something called the Canada Forest. Trees planted with Canadian funds, Jewish, mostly Jewish donations. And the Palestinians would sometimes come and sneak in and burn down some of those trees. So they talked about tree terrorism. Well, what they didn't know is, and didn't want to know, is the Canada Forest was built at the site of Palestinian villages that were destroyed and bulldozed over by the Israeli army in 1967. And the settlers regularly burned down Palestinian olive groves, which is their livelihood, the olive oil. And then they prayed it in the synagogues about tree terrorism. You know, and my children were studying for their bar mitzvah then, and so I went to services regularly. I didn't say anything.
Yeah.
I couldn't stand up and say anything. You know, at that time I couldn't. So I witnessed this. I cried for 2 weeks. I came back and I wrote about it. That's the first time I went back. I went to Gaza. Who were the Gazans? 70% of them were, in the 1990s, still either the direct refugees, people who had been expelled by main force from a few miles away, where from across the barbed wire, they can view their lands being tilled by new immigrants and new Israelis. These are the Gazans. And they're living in these hovels. This is in the 1990s. Now, I went back again in early 2000s after the Oslo Accords, which is a complete sellout of the Palestinians by their own leadership. And because they never stopped the right for the Israelis to keep settling the land and keep taking over the land. And we again went to the territories. It was marginally better then because in the aftermath of Oslo there was some hope. But I could tell that this was going nowhere because the settlements were expanding.
And Gaza, just so people know, Gaza Strip anyways, is I think it's 5 miles by 24 miles with 2 or 3 million people. Like it's,
I mean,
compacted.
There's an Israeli, again, anybody who's listening and thinks this is Arab propaganda, there's an Israeli sociologist, Baruch Kimmerling, who said that Gaza is the world's largest concentration camp.
Wow.
Which it is. You know, and so again, I'm telling you, Don't listen to me. I'm just a Canadian, Hungarian Canadian. Listen to the Israelis who talk like this. Then I went back again last year,
Okay.
2022. I was asked to go and work with Palestinian women as a trauma healer. I was asked to go back and work with Palestinian women who'd been tortured in Israeli jails, because the torture is relentless. It's, what can I say?
Yeah.
They know how to torture people. One woman told me that she was being interrogated and she began to menstruate. She began to bleed through her clothing. They pointed at her, they mocked her. So I was asked to go back and work with women with PTSD as a result of being tortured in Israeli jails. And one woman told me that there's no post-traumatic stress disorder here because the trauma is never post. It's ongoing. You know, I mentioned that poll in Canada where most Canadians knew nothing or little about the residential schools. It's the same in Israel.
I was wondering, because most Israelis are good, kind, generous people. Do you think they just are unaware of...
Oh, they're totally unaware.
Yeah.
They have no idea. I have one of my best friends with whom I've maintained a very tenuous relationship the last few years because we so disagree. But he's from here. He lives in Haifa. He's never traveled a few miles that it would take him to witness with his own eyes what's happening in the occupied territories. Just as the average white South African had no idea,
Yeah.
the average Israeli has no idea. All they know is the Arabs keep attacking us,
Yeah.
and they have no idea what they do to them daily. Now, earlier this year, this is 2023, this is October the 26th, we're barely 3 weeks, almost 3 weeks to the date of the horrors of October the 7th. There were pogroms by settlers killing Palestinians all year this year. Nobody reports it. Children being killed. Nobody reports it. When a Ukrainian child dies, his family's story is told in the press. When an Israeli child dies at the hands of Palestinians, the same thing. Palestinian children are anonymous. Their stories don't feature on our newspapers. Their experience, with the exception maybe now of these horrible bombings, but the daily experience of living under the occupation is just whitewashed from people's consciousness. And the few Israelis who talk about it and write about it, and they do, and they document it, most Israelis don't read them. It's too painful. Because to read this would be to go back to your question about identity. To read this stuff and to actually come to terms with it. Just as for an American to come to terms with slavery and the genocide of the indigenous population, they'd have to really come to terms with their identity. And what are they identifying with?
Well, they're not identifying as a perpetrator.
Yeah.
They're probably identifying as a victim.
And
I don't want to identify as a perpetrator.
And everybody everywhere, and we've talked about this.
Yeah.
I'd much rather be a victim of my wife than somebody responsible for...
I think we can all relate to that in our lives.
And I have to emphasize this. On a collective level, this is much more powerful than an individual level. I'm much more likely to question myself and to become aware of myself as a person if I should offend you. I'm much more likely to acknowledge and take responsibility for it than people are on the collective level. And what's his name? Is it Peter Beinart, a religious Jew. He's written very articulately. And he really identifies, well, he's a Jew. I'm not a religious Jew. I'm a secular Jew. I don't, I celebrate some of the holidays, but not from the point of view of a faith-based identification with the religion, but certainly as a Jew, but he does it as a religious Jew. And he said recently, in the aftermath of the recent events, is that the identification is such that Jews harboring collective hatred and vengeful feelings towards the Palestinians is a way of Jews bonding with each other. So even hatred and revenge becomes a bond. It's not conscious. It's not because people are bad. That's how the psyche works.
Yeah, and it works on other sides.
It works that way all around, you know. The only thing I want to address here is that there's a powerful movement to identify any non-Jewish criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And any non-Jew, and maybe you've experienced this, even if you have certain feelings and opinions on this subject, you might not dare utter them for fear of hurting Jewish friends who see every criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism and who have suffered from anti-Semitism and who live in a world where anti-Semitism continues to be a reality.
Absolutely.
And you don't want to be identified with that. Therefore, you won't say a thing as a non-Jew about Israel because you're so afraid of being tarred with that brush or adding to that kind of pain.
I was reading, so there was a person a CEO of a company who resigned the other day, and basically he had posted war crimes are war crimes, regardless of who commits them or whether they're allies. And there was such a backlash that he resigned. And so there is this very tender nervousness for anybody to say anything, or even that Israel should follow basic, protocol of the Geneva Convention or not. Like, you're right, there's such a fear and a tenderness around that. So I definitely feel that, and also feel like we have responsibility as human beings to speak to things that alleviate suffering. But there is such a tenderness there that maybe you know it better or know how to speak to it better.
Well, I understand that.
And anti-Semitism is real and happens, and so I realize that that's not like, I'm not avoiding that fact, but I'm just also acknowledging that all of us need to be able to reflect, and all of us need feedback.
Yeah.
And all of us can be perpetrators and victims sometimes at the same time.
Absolutely.
And nobody gets a pass,
a free pass
that says you're only a victim no matter what you do in the world. Because not against them, but because it's not of service to their own safety and our own healing. Ultimately it's not.
I would say to any human being, check yourself. Do you have anti-Semitic feelings? You might. If you do, examine them. And until you're sure, don't say much or anything. But don't let the charge itself intimidate you from speaking your conscience. Just don't give them that victory. Because it's being weaponized quite consciously as a way of shutting people up. A Canadian member of legislature in Ontario was censured and expelled from her party for speaking on the part of Palestinians. I've had a major lecture at a Canadian university canceled because of somebody's interpretation of my views on Palestine, Israel. There's intimidation going on all the time. Be sensitive. There is anti-Semitism in the world. It's genuine, but don't conflate it with criticism of Palestine. And I'd say one more thing too. Sometimes people say to me, you're just feeding anti-Semitism by criticizing Israel. I'm going to look those people in the eye and say, what on earth are you talking about? First of all, anti-Semitism is not created by facts. The anti-Semite doesn't care about facts. They're a sick person motivated by hatred. That has nothing to do with Jews. As Jean-Paul Sartre said very clearly, the anti-Semite is most of all afraid of himself, not the Jew. So anti-Semitism is a form of ideological, psychological illness.
As other forms of racism
as all kinds of racism, for sure. Secondly, but if, so I don't think how Jews speak and act create anti-Semitism. There's a famous story I'll tell you about a Roman emperor who's being driven in his chariot through the streets of Rome, and this Jewish person fails to greet him. And the emperor says, punish him, for failing to honor the Emperor of Rome. 5 minutes later, another Jew obsequiously greets the Roman Emperor. The Emperor says, punish him. How dare he, as a Jew, draw his attention to himself in the presence of the Emperor. And his friends and his servants say to him, but my lord, you...
Yeah.
He says, you don't understand. I just hate the Jews. Whatever they do galls me. Whether they greet me, whether they don't, I'm going to hate them. But that's an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Now, so what the Jew does or doesn't do doesn't create anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
On the one hand, if it did, which would create more anti-Semitism? If all Jews unite in supporting the massacre of innocents and don't question themselves, or if Jews are seen to have an honest debate, whichever side is right, but at least they're seen to be questioning themselves or questioning one another, which is more likely to foment anti-Semitism? Yeah. You tell me. You know,
well,
it's certainly not.
Yeah, and I also think that, you know, that because of pain that has happened to me, it doesn't mean that it's impossible for me to cause pain to somebody else. Like, it's almost like saying, well, if you're Jewish, you can't be racist. Well, like, no, you can be Jewish and you can be racist against African Americans. Like, that we have multiple parts, right? And it's so easy to say, no, I'm just this one. And I think what humanity potentially is being asked for now, as hard as it is to see, wow, I have all these different parts in me. Yes, of course I'm this, and I have capacities to do this.
Which takes me back to the Old Testament, or what we call the Tanakh, or the Torah, the 5 books of Moses.
Yeah. And for me, that's one of the more difficult things. If I'm in an argument with my partner, I want to think I'm the right one, and she shouldn't dislike me or hate me or be upset with me. And it's so hard to stop and say, let me understand her perspective.
Yeah.
Let me stop for a moment and see why she's upset with me.
Yeah.
And I wish that there was a way that I could also better understand the sensitivity of some of the Israeli community right now because of that. Like, don't criticize us. Like, anything that criticizes us is not allowed. I was like, help me understand, because I do feel like that's not really what they want. And I do feel like we are all part of the problem. We're all part of the solution. And how do we move forward in a way that leads us to the world that is better for the whole generation of kids that are to come? And I don't think we're doing it in the best way possible. And I think...
Well, the people who could really address that, but I'm quoting mutual acquaintances of ours, Dan Siegel, the psychiatrist. He'll point out, and Stephen Porges, another psychologist, and they'll point out that at times of pressure and fear, our perspective narrows. Mm-hmm. And the part of our brain that takes over is more the fear-based and defensive-based, flight or fight. So we lose the governance of our prefrontal cortex, which is capable of taking a broader view.
Yeah.
So on the time, and oh boy, let me tell you, this is an Israeli friend of mine who I quoted before. She contacted me, and she's the one with a daughter, and they live in the north of Israel, where as a result of recent events, people, they've decided to evacuate some communities owing to a threat of further violence, not just in the south, but also in the north of Israel. And she writes to me, very honestly, she says, "Dear Gabor, I really appreciate the things you wrote. The days here are unbearable. We moved in with friends because we live in an unprotected ground floor, surrounded by a garden, so beautiful usually, but home no longer feels like a safe place for millions right now." And she's talking about Israelis.
Yeah.
She's well aware, by the way, of the Palestinian situation.
Yeah.
But she's describing her own situation.
Yeah.
The rest of the time, I work at a mental health center, and we collapse under the referrals and the meetings and the frantic courses we take to treat ongoing trauma. She says, I'm exhausted, she writes. And she says, and I wrote her some words of support, and she says, the things you wrote are beautiful, but perspective expands when people are not under physical threat. Right now, I feel under physical threat, and so do those close to me, and my point of view is very narrow.
Wow.
Now that's a very honest statement.
Yeah.
She's making no apology.
Yeah.
She's not taking a political stance.
Yeah.
She's saying right now my perspective is very narrow.
Yeah.
She doesn't want to identify with that narrow perspective, but she understands that under the pressure, that's what happens. Now, most people are not that self-aware.
Yeah.
As Dan and Stephen would point out, people's perspective narrow.
Of course.
And it becomes subsumed in group identification
Yeah.
and thoughts of revenge
Yeah.
and thought of hurting the other.
Yeah.
That's just, the Jewish holiday, Passover,
Mm-hmm.
which celebrates the, whether historical or mythical,
Yeah.
liberation of Jews from Egyptian slavery. Mitzrayim, the word for Hebrew. So the Hebrew word for Egypt, Mitzrayim, you know what it means? It means a narrow place. So under threat, or when we perceive us under a threat, we go into this narrow place.
Yeah.
That's a place of slavery.
Yeah.
Where we're enslaved to our unconscious.
Yeah.
Where we're governed by our emotions.
Yeah.
And where the heart closes down. And, oh my God,
Yeah.
if there was ever a time to actually people to open their hearts,
Yeah.
to not get stuck in a narrow place, to not repeat the past,
Yeah.
to not to perceive themselves only as victims, but in relationship with the other,
Yeah.
and have the willingness to examine my role in that relationship, which is all we ask for in any marriage, by the way, or in any relationship. The practical difference is that one side wields enormously more power than the other. That's just how it is. Israel has the fourth most powerful military in the world. We're talking after the US and China and Russia. It's a nuclear power, which nobody talks about, but also nobody questions. It was created maybe as an act of self-resurrection on a national level, if you want to see it that way, but at the cost of crucifying another people. Couldn't have been done any other way, no matter what anybody imagines. An occupation that's been going on now for over 50 years, where most of the Jews that Palestinians see wear uniforms, carry guns, oppress them, kill them, destroy their homes. Where in Gaza, and it almost tires me to go over the history of Gaza again, but it's not what people imagine. It's not this, Israel didn't leave Gaza, they just moved to the outskirts of it. And they've maintained the concentration camp. The Gazans have no freedom to move, no freedom to import, to export, no freedom to control what comes into their land. They can't fish in their own sea. They're surveyed. They're bombed regularly. Hundreds of their children are being killed on a regular basis, over and over and over and over again. And these are people who can look across the barbed wire and look at the fields that their forebears used to till.
We can open our, we can open our heart.
Yeah, we can open our heart. So what's their experience like? And the only Jews they see are snipers and tanks carrying the Jewish flag, the Star of David. Even if they hate Jews. And by the way, when I was there, and other people can tell you this, including Israelis who visited there, most Palestinians don't hate Jews. Some do. But even those who do, can I equate them with the anti-Semites of Eastern Europe? The Jews never hurt anybody in Europe. They were simply the victims of race hatred. But when the only Jews you see shoot you when you demonstrate peacefully, which is what happened in Gaza over and over again, the world didn't pay attention. but Gazans would march up to the barrier with flags and without weapons, and their medical workers would be shot by snipers. This happened for years.
Yeah.
The press barely paid attention. So that's the only Jews they see. Could we maybe understand, not agree with, not justify, but could we understand that those are the only Jews they see? Some of them might hate Jews.
Yeah.
And that we don't have to identify that hatred of Jews with the
entire population.
First of all, with the entire population, and number two, with the ancient race hatred of Jews that they experienced in Europe.
Yeah, and that to create a livable region in that area, I feel for all the Israelis now that live in fear, right? And I feel for the Palestinians that live in fear. And so to create a more livable situation where there is not that fear of a suicide bomber or a bomb coming in, whatever the fears would be, there's a certain shift, a certain orientation shift that feels like it needs to happen. And as you said, the world community is a part of it. I, as an American, am a part of that. I don't leave it up to any one group to do that. I feel like there's a bigger shift. And can you help us, maybe you already have it, can you help us understand how that shift might take place, and how, if you're part of the Israeli establishment right now, or leadership, if you're part of the Palestinian leadership, part of the U.S. leadership, what is the expression of a new way of orienting that might give us even just like an inch toward a different path?
I don't want to address anything I say to the leadership, and I tell you why not. Because they don't have good faith.
Okay.
They have interests.
Yeah.
And they serve interests. And they're slavishly beholden to those interests that they
Maybe
serve.
to the people then.
But I love to talk to people, ordinary people.
Great.
The leaders created the present situation. They didn't have to. They didn't have to create this. They did. But to ordinary people, I would say, first of all, have your feelings. You can't help having them. And they're natural responses to your perception of the situation and to the objective situation in many cases. But just as in any relationship, don't let your emotions govern your decisions.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, can you for a moment put your hand on your heart and imagine what it's like to be the other? And I say that to both sides.
Yeah.
I say it more to the Jewish side for two reasons. One is because I'm a Jew myself. I'm much more concerned with the emotional and spiritual well-being of my own people. The Old Testament says, "Thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, you who yourself have been strangers in Egypt." You know the heart of a stranger. Well, a stranger means the other.
Yeah.
Allow yourself to know the heart of the other. Our own scriptures tell us so.
Yeah.
Be interested in their experience. You don't have to agree with their interpretation of the experience, but at least know what their experience was and know why they see things the way they do. That Eretz Havatala, the land of milk and honey, it could be.
Yeah.
It actually could be. And there be many other places in the world where there's been tremendous hatred and now there's peace. There's lots of other places where there's been tremendous hatred and still is, unfortunately. Israel is not unique in that sense. Palestine, Israel, is not a unique dynamic. We can see so many places where ethnic identification and misperception leads to so many conflicts. But I say to people, open your heart. Just put your hand on your heart. Imagine for a moment what it's like to be the other. Just for a moment. And have some curiosity. I talked about history as not being what happened, but in its original Greek meaning is an inquiry, is an investigation. Do it. The evidence exists. And you don't have to look to the other side to tell you the evidence. Look at the courageous and conscientious historians and journalists on your side who have looked at the truth, documented it, published it, and spoken about it. When Yom Kippur is the greatest Jewish holiday there is, the Day of Atonement, which some people say is the Day of Atonement, where we actually recognize our mutual friend Dan Siegel wrote a book called Interconnected. I don't know how Dan feels about this issue. I haven't talked to him, and I don't know how he feels about being quoted here. So I'm not interpreting his political views here. I'm talking about his wisdom. You know, wrote a book called Interconnected, where from the very inside, we're at one and connected with everybody else. So recognize our interconnection and our interconnection. The Day of Atonement, the Day of At-One-ment, when we're supposed to recognize our oneness with all that there is, enjoins us to look at how we've hurt others, not at what was done to us. We have 364 days a year to lament what was done to us. But on our greatest holiday, we're asked to look at ourselves. And I say, don't just do that individually. Do it collectively. I think my experience in Sarajevo, in Belgrade, in Budapest, in Prague, in Transylvania, in Scotland, in England, I'm talking about my last 4-week trip. People just want to be human. They want peace in their hearts. They actually want to love. They feel better when they're open and full of love and expansive. I mean, imagine your own state. When do you feel better? I'm not talking about when do you feel right, but when is your body more at ease? It's when we're open, you know. That's what people want. So allow yourself that state, and in that state, recognize the emotions that you have. At the same time, just for a moment, understand the other, understand the stranger, you know. And the Old Testament I was referring to before is very much a double-edged document.
Sure.
On the one hand, it advocates genocide, and God at some point threatens the Jews because they didn't kill all the local inhabitants of Palestine when they came in as conquerors. And then on the other hand, it says you will not oppress the stranger. And the prophets then come along and magnify that statement. So there's plenty in our tradition that would allow us to be proud of who we are and to declare who we are, and at the same time not be at odds with people who at the very least are our cousins.
Gabor, thank you for taking the time to talk about an issue that I know is on a lot of people's hearts and minds. And I know it's delicate, and really appreciate your courage and your thoughtfulness and your care of exploring ways that potentially could be healing, both for the current population, but for future populations. And I'm wondering, as we kind of close this interview, anything else on your mind and heart that feels important to say? And so,
well, you know, I was 9 or 10, maybe 11, when I first read about the Holocaust. There was a book on my parents' shelf that they kept above our reach of our kids as kids, and I climbed up on a chair and pulled it down. And it was called The Scourge of the Swastika by a British person who was a member of the House of Lords, but he had also been a civil servant and an officer at Nuremberg trials. And for years, I'm talking about for years afterwards, there wasn't a day when I didn't think about it. And literally my head would spin. I would always be dizzy. I say, 6 million people, how is this possible? Like, why? So this why of how people can impose such suffering on each other. It's been so alive for me all my life, and certainly my investigations of history, my researches, as Herodotus would say, from my experience as a physician, getting involved with trauma, human development, has led me to understand that so much of what governs us is unconscious. And that's Robert Sapolsky is quite right. That in many ways, more ways than we imagine, we lack freedom of will because we're controlled by unconscious forces. If there is free will, it rests in becoming conscious. So, number one, I just hope people can actually strive for consciousness, which means being aware of their own reactions and their sources, and to take responsibility for them. Number one. Number two, well, I have tremendous gratitude for you for initiating and conducting this conversation, because, as I said, there's no subject in the world that touches me more than this one, for so many reasons that I've mentioned. I believe in people, you know. I would not be having this conversation. And at times when I've spoken on a subject, I've used words that in retrospect I wish I hadn't used. But fundamentally, my intention has always been to shed some light on the truth, and I believe in the truth. I believe that people want truth. And I do believe those spiritual teachers who have us understand that it's the absence of truth in our lives, not facts, but of a deep truth of connection to ourselves and to everybody else, that creates so much suffering in the world. Now, the ancient Hindu text, the or spiritual narrative, the Mahabharata, of which the Bhagavad Gita is just one chapter, it said somewhere that as soon as you believe that your children are more important than the children of somebody else, war is inevitable.
Wow.
So I like people to think about all the children and all the sides of this. And I like everybody involved in this conflict, Jewish or Palestinian, Israeli or Christian, whether they're experiencing the events or whether they're participating in them or whether they're just observing them, just to remember that. Fundamentally, if I didn't believe in people, there'd be no reason to have this conversation. I think we do have the capacity to come to our true selves. On this subject, and I thank all those who've been watching us, because this is not an easy conversation. I also know that there are so many questions people will have about this aspect of the history or that aspect of the history. What about this agreement? What about that agreement? What about this event, that event? It's impossible. If you buy into a simple narrative, us good, them bad, then everything makes sense. But if you at all want to find out the actual truth, you're going to have to find out that a lot of the things you've believed in may not reflect reality. In the last chapter of my book, The Myth of Normal, I talk about the virtues of disillusionment. And I've been disillusioned a number of times in my life. One was a good little communist growing up in Eastern Europe. I had no idea what oppressive system I was living under until the Hungarian Revolution, of which the anniversary was this Monday, on the 23rd of October, the day that I flew back from Hungary to Canada. And then the scales fell from my eyes, and I realized that everything I believed publicly had been a lie. And then I got disillusioned with so-called American democracy when I saw them murder, with most people's ignorance, 3 million Vietnamese in the service of everything.
Democracy.
That was so-called democracy, but it was all proved to be a lie. Then I got disillusioned with Zionism for reasons I've already mentioned. I'm saying to people, it's not a bad thing to be disillusioned. Would you rather be illusioned or disillusioned? Would you rather believe in a world that does not root itself in reality, or would you rather know what's going on?
Yeah.
It's painful to be disillusioned. If you really want to know the truth, you're going to have to suffer pain because you've identified with something. And letting go of a piece of your identity, not of your true self, but what you've made yourself the same as,
Right.
can be painful.
Mm-hmm.
Are you ready for some pain? No. A lot of people who watch this may end up hating all of it.
Mm-hmm.
I understand.
Yeah.
I used to believe what you believe. I don't anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing in me will ever dictate me to stop speaking the truth as I understand it, which doesn't mean I'm right. It just means this is the truth as I understand it. And that's what I try to present. I'm grateful for everybody who's listened, whether you agree or not, just for your presence. I know that no matter what you believe, I'm talking to fellow human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, Soren, I'm just so grateful that you created this opportunity. I mean, I'm not even sure where it came from.
I don't know where it came from either.
But here we are.
Yeah.
And I've had an opportunity here to speak my truth, which is all that I can ever ask for.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you. And deep appreciation to you, Gabor, and I appreciate our friendship and I appreciate your willingness. And one just last piece, I think the part about disillusionment is so essential. As life goes on, we see things more clearly. And I think there's this kind of question of hope. And I don't know what in that process of learning about yourself or for humanity, is there a sense of what gives you hope? And you must see people go through amazing healing. And I just wanted to wonder if you had some final thoughts on what keeps you writing books and what keeps you speaking and what keeps you out there in the world.
Well, so hope is not a word that I use. Because hope is something that you're wishing for will happen in the future. Yeah. I believe in something much more powerful than hope, which is possibility. And I've seen it. Yeah. I've seen individuals in the throes of severe illness, mental or physical, caught up in debilitating addictions. And I've seen healing, which literally means wholeness. Yeah. And it's much harder on a collective level. Because there's so many other forces. Yeah. It's not a tough question of people's individual goodwill. There are political and economic forces driving what gets decided, what information people are allowed to see, what they're not permitted to witness, and so on. So if it was only a matter of people's individual will, for the most part, this would be a very peaceful and happy world. Yeah. But we're living in a much more complex universe. But, you know, I go back to Anne Frank, who said, and I forget the exact words, but that despite it all, I believe that fundamentally people are good. Yeah. And I do believe that on all sides. And that's what we're speaking into. We're speaking into that possibility of people acknowledging and recognizing and experiencing their own goodness. It's not a hope. It's a genuine possibility in the present moment. The other thing I'm moved to mention is a communication I received from a black man in his late 30s in a Texas death row institution. He committed a murder when he was 18. Typical trauma history, a life beset by racism and a broken family and abuse and so on, and started using drugs, joined a gang, committed a robbery in the course of which someone became killed. He's responsible. Of course, he's sentenced to death. Yeah. This is Texas. As the appeal process go on, which as you know can go on for decades, he's undertaken and experienced some healing. He's read my books and he sent me a video thanking me for how much my book on addiction has meant for his own understanding of himself. He's done meditation. People came and taught him meditation. They taught him about trauma. And now he understands, and he's got full remorse for what he did. If he wins his appeal, the best thing he can hope for is life in prison without parole. And he says, I'm addicted to life. I love every moment because I'm so in touch with myself and with the world. So if somebody in a Texas death row whose best hope is life in prison without parole can love other human beings, can take responsibility for what he did, can be in love with life, so can we all. And that's the possibility.
Yeah.
Not a hope.
Yeah.
That's the possibility.
Got it. Thank you. I think we'll end there. Gabor and community, thank you so much for joining us and for being a part of this. We really appreciate your time and your attention and your commitment. So take care.